The GPS signal died first. Then the headlights began to dim as Victoria Chen pressed harder on the accelerator, her minivan lurching through snow that had transformed from gentle flakes into a wall of white fury. In the back seat, 4-year-old Quadruplets sat strapped into their car seats, their excited chatter about visiting Grandma slowly fading into concerned whispers as the storm swallowed the mountain road whole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria's knuckles were bone white against the steering wheel. She had made this drive from Denver to her mother's cabin in the Colorado Rockies dozens of times, but never in weather like this. The meteorologists had called for light snow. They hadn't mentioned anything about a sudden temperature drop that would turn Highway 285 into a frozen death trap. 40 miles behind them, Dr. James Crow Feather was closing his clinic for the day when the emergency dispatch crackled through his radio. A vehicle had been spotted by a snowplow driver before vanishing into the white abyss near Kenosha Pass. The description matched reports of a missing family from Denver. As the only medical professional within 50 miles who knew these mountains, like the back of his weathered hands, James knew what the next few hours would bring. Victoria Chen was about to discover that survival wasn't just about staying warm, and Dr. Crow Feather was about to prove that some rescues require more than medical training. They demand the ancient wisdom of reading a mountain's deadly moods. Victoria had been a widow for 8 months, though the grief still hit her like a physical blow at unexpected moments. Michael's sudden heart attack had left her not just emotionally shattered, but practically overwhelmed by the reality of raising quadruplets alone. Emma, Ethan, Olivia, and Noah, her fantastic four, as Michael used to call them, had turned 4 just last month, and their endless energy seemed to multiply exponentially in inverse proportion to her own depleting reserves. The decision to drive to her mother's cabin for Thanksgiving week had been impulsive, born from desperation more than planning. Victoria's mother, Eleanor, had been calling daily since Halloween, her voice thick with worry about how thin Victoria sounded, how tired she seemed during their video calls. "Bring those babies up here," Eleanor had insisted. "The mountain air will do you all good, and I'll cook enough food to last through Christmas." Victoria had packed the minivan that Tuesday morning with the methodical efficiency that single parenthood had taught her. 4 small suitcases, identical except for the colored tags she used to distinguish each child's belongings. Blue for Ethan, pink for Emma, purple for Olivia, green for Noah. Snacks carefully portioned into individual containers to prevent the territorial disputes that could erupt over goldfish crackers. Tablets loaded with educational games and cartoons, backup chargers, first aid kit, and enough wet wipes to clean a small army. The weather report had been encouraging, partly cloudy with possible light snow, temperatures in the mid-30s, perfect autumn weather for a mountain drive. Victoria had felt something approaching optimism as they pulled out of their suburban Denver driveway at 10 in the morning. The children singing along to their favorite playlist while she mentally planned the first real break she'd had since Michael's funeral. Highway 285 wound through some of Colorado's most spectacular scenery, and on clear days, Victoria loved this drive. The road carved through valleys where aspens stood like golden sentinels, their leaves creating a shimmering canopy that seemed to dance in the wind. Today, however, the trees were bare, their dark branches reaching toward a sky that had grown increasingly ominous as they climbed higher into the mountains. The snow had started gently around noon, just as they passed through the town of Fairplay. Victoria had smiled at the timing, thinking how perfectly it would set the scene for their Thanksgiving week. The children pressed their faces to the windows, their breath fogging the glass as they pointed excitedly at the fat flakes drifting down like feathers. "Mommy, will we build snowmen at Grandma's house?" Emma asked, her voice carrying that particular blend of excitement and hope that always made Victoria's chest tighten with protective love. "Of course, sweetheart," Victoria had replied, adjusting the rearview mirror to see all four faces. "Grandma has that big field behind her cabin. We'll build a whole snow family." But by 1:30, the gentle snowfall had transformed into something altogether more menacing. The flakes grew smaller and more aggressive, driven by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Victoria found herself leaning forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. With the accumulation, the temperature gauge on her dashboard showed a steady drop, and she noticed other vehicles beginning to pull over at scenic overlooks and rest areas. Smart drivers, she thought. People who understood mountains better than she did. But Eleanor was expecting them by 3 o'clock, and Victoria had promised the children they'd arrive in time for hot chocolate and Grandma's famous sugar cookies. Kenosha Pass sat at 10,001 feet above sea level, a fact Victoria knew from the countless times she'd driven this route. What she didn't know was how quickly weather could change at that elevation, how a slight shift in wind patterns could transform a manageable snowfall into a whiteout that erased the distinction between road and ravine. The GPS began glitching. First, the screen flickering between accurate positioning and wild miscalculations that showed them driving through the middle of nowhere. Victoria tapped the screen, tried restarting the device, but the satellite connection was clearly compromised. By the storm, no matter, she told herself. She knew this road. She'd driven it enough times to navigate by landmarks. Except the landmarks were disappearing. The familiar gas station where they usually stopped for snacks was barely visible through the snow. The distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to Eleanor's cabin vanished entirely behind. A curtain of white. Victoria's confidence began to erode as systematically as the visibility outside her windshield. "Mommy, I can't see anything," Olivia said from the back seat, her voice smaller than usual. "It's okay, baby," Victoria replied, though her own voice carried an edge of uncertainty she hoped the children wouldn't notice. "We're almost to Grandma's house." But they weren't anywhere. Victoria realized with a growing alarm that she hadn't seen another vehicle in over 20 minutes. The road beneath them was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding terrain, and what she had assumed were the familiar curves of Highway 285 might have been something else entirely. The minivan's headlights, which had seemed adequate in Denver's urban environment, proved woefully insufficient for cutting through the mountain storm. They created a weak bubble of visibility that extended perhaps 15 feet ahead, illuminating nothing but swirling snow and the vague suggestion of pavement beneath their tires. Victoria's hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and a tension headache was building behind her eyes. The children had grown quieter, sensing the shift in their mother's mood, even if they couldn't articulate what was wrong. Noah, the most sensitive of the four, had started that particular whimper that usually preceded a full crying jag. "It's going to be okay," Victoria said, as much to herself as to her children. "We're just going to drive very slowly and carefully until we get through this storm." But the storm wasn't something to get through. It was something that surrounded them, enveloped them, and seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The wind began rocking the minivan with gusts that made Victoria's heart race. She slowed to 20 miles per hour, then 15, then 10, as the road became increasingly treacherous. That's when she saw the red taillights ahead of her, barely visible through the snow, but reassuring in their familiarity. Another vehicle, moving slowly but steadily through the storm. Victoria felt a wave of relief wash over her. She would follow those lights, let someone else navigate, while she focused on keeping her van on the road. For 10 minutes, this strategy worked perfectly. The red lights provided a beacon to follow, and Victoria felt her anxiety begin to subside, slightly. The children, perhaps sensing their mother's improved mood, began chatting again about their planned activities at Grandma's house. Then the lights turned left, off what Victoria had assumed was the main highway. Victoria faced a choice that would define the next several hours of their lives. She could continue straight on what she hoped was Highway 285, trusting her own navigation skills in zero visibility, or she could follow the red lights, trusting that whoever was driving ahead of her knew where they were going. The decision seemed obvious. Follow the lights, follow someone who appeared confident about their direction in this impossible weather. Victoria turned left. 20 minutes later, she realized her mistake. The road had become increasingly narrow, the surface rougher, the surrounding trees pressing closer to both sides of her vehicle. This wasn't Highway 285. This wasn't any major road at all. She had followed those red lights onto what appeared to be a Forest Service road, a path that might lead to a remote cabin or might simply dead end in the wilderness. The red lights were gone now, either because the other vehicle had reached its destination or because they had taken yet another turn that Victoria had missed in the whiteout conditions. She was alone with her 4 children on an unknown road in the middle of a blizzard that showed no signs of abating. Victoria pulled the minivan to what she hoped was the side of the road and put it in park. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her cell phone, knowing already what she would find: no signal. At this elevation, in this weather, with the nearest cell tower probably miles away, her phone was just an expensive paperweight. The children sensed the change immediately. Emma started asking why they had stopped. Ethan wanted to know where Grandma's house was. Olivia began crying, and Noah joined her with the sympathetic wailing that twins sometimes shared. Victoria closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, a technique her grief counselor had taught her for managing overwhelming moments. When she opened them, she looked at her fuel gauge and felt her stomach drop. Less than a quarter tank remaining. In her optimistic morning planning, she had calculated that they would reach Eleanor's cabin with fuel to spare, planning to fill up at the gas station in the valley on the other side of the mountain. That plan now seemed as naive as everything else about this journey. "Okay, everyone," Victoria said, turning in her seat to face her children with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "We're going to play a new game. It's called Staying Warm and Cozy While Mommy Figures Out Where We Are." She reached into the back of the van and pulled out the heavy blankets she had packed for their stay at the cabin. Eleanor's place was charming but notoriously drafty, and Victoria had come prepared for chilly mountain nights. Now those blankets might serve a more urgent purpose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm outside was intensifying, and Victoria could feel the temperature dropping, even inside the vehicle. She started the engine and turned up the heat, knowing that she was burning precious fuel, but unable to let her children get cold. The warm air filled the cabin, and the children's crying subsided into sniffles and occasional questions about when they would get to Grandma's house. Victoria told them stories to pass the time, making up adventures about brave children who got lost in magical forests and always found their way home. But even as she spun tales of happy endings, she was calculating odds and options in her head. How long could they stay warm with the remaining fuel? How long before someone would notice they were missing? Eleanor wasn't expecting them for hours yet, and Victoria hadn't told anyone else about their travel plans. As darkness began to fall, though it was difficult to distinguish from the storm-darkened afternoon, Victoria made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. She turned off the engine to conserve fuel and bundled her children together under the blankets. "We're going to have a sleepover adventure in the van," she told them, her voice steady, despite the fear crawling up her throat. Just like camping, but warmer and cozier. What Victoria didn't know was that 40 miles away, Dr. James Crow Feather had already begun tracking their path through the storm, using a combination of weather reports, road conditions, and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from spending 30 years in these mountains. He had narrowed their possible location to 3 different areas. What she also didn't know was that the red lights she had followed belonged to a local rancher who knew every back road in the county and who had noticed a minivan following him. Onto Forest Service Road 294. The rancher had reached his destination safely, but he had also called the sheriff's department to report a possible lost vehicle. And what Victoria couldn't have known was that her decision to conserve fuel by turning off the engine, while logically sound, had also eliminated the heat signature. That search and rescue teams would need to locate them from the air once the storm cleared enough for helicopters to fly. In the growing darkness of the Colorado wilderness, Victoria Chen held her 4 children close and waited for a rescue that might never come. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping, the temperature continued to drop, and somewhere in the distance, Dr. James Crow Feather was preparing for the most challenging search of his career. Dr. James Crow Feather had learned to read storms the way most people read newspapers, with practiced attention to details that others might miss. At 53, he carried the weathered face of someone who had spent decades moving between 2 worlds. The modern medical facility where he served as the region's only emergency physician, and the ancient wisdom passed down through 4 generations. Of his Lakota grandmother's teachings, the radio dispatch had reached him at 4:47 p.m., just as he was reviewing patient charts in his clinic 30 miles south of the search area. Missing family, minivan, last seen near Kenosha Pass before the storm intensified. Standard information, but James had immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. November storms in this region could turn deadly within hours, and civilian vehicles were particularly vulnerable on the maze of Forest Service roads that branched off from the main highways. James closed his clinic with the methodical efficiency of someone who had responded to dozens of similar emergencies. Medical bag secured in his modified Jeep Cherokee, emergency beacon activated, GPS coordinates logged for the 3 most likely areas where a lost vehicle might have taken shelter. He had learned long ago that successful mountain rescues required equal parts scientific preparation and intuitive understanding of how people behaved when fear took control of their decision-making. The storm was unlike anything the region had experienced in early November. James checked his weather monitoring equipment and found readings that made him recalculate his initial rescue timeline. Wind speeds approaching 40 miles per hour, visibility reduced to less than 50 feet, and temperatures dropping toward 0. These weren't conditions for a standard search and rescue operation. This was a race against hypothermia, and the clock had already been running for 3 hours. James's Cherokee was equipped for exactly this type of emergency. All-terrain tires with chains, emergency medical supplies rated for trauma situations, and most importantly, the kind of 4-wheel drive system that could handle terrain where most vehicles would surrender. He had spent 15 years modifying this vehicle for mountain rescues, understanding that reaching someone in crisis often mattered more than the sophistication of the treatment available once he arrived. The first search area yielded nothing but empty road and deepening snowdrifts. James methodically worked his way through each possible route, using a combination of radio communication with other searchers and his own systematic approach to tracking vehicle movements during storms. Most lost drivers followed predictable patterns when visibility disappeared, and James had studied those patterns extensively during his years of emergency response. Radio chatter kept him updated on the broader search effort. County Sheriff's Department had two vehicles working the main highway corridors. State Patrol was coordinating with snowplow operators to check rest areas and pullouts. Mountain rescue volunteers were preparing equipment for what might become an overnight operation if the storm didn't break by morning. But James knew something the other searchers didn't. His grandmother had taught him to feel weather patterns in his bones, to recognize when natural forces were building towards something more dangerous than standard meteorological predictions could capture. This storm carried the signature of what his grandmother had called spirit snow, weather that seemed almost intentionally focused on testing human endurance and preparation. The second search area proved equally empty, but James noticed something that made him reconsider his approach. Tire tracks, barely visible but still present in a section where wind patterns had created a temporary shelter from the driving snow. The tracks were wider than standard passenger car tires, consistent with a minivan, and they showed the distinctive pattern of someone driving very slowly through deteriorating conditions. More significantly, the track showed where the vehicle had stopped, idled for several minutes, then continued in a direction that diverged from the main Forest Service road. James knelt beside the tracks, brushing away loose snow to examine the tread pattern more closely. The depth and spacing suggested a fully loaded vehicle, consistent with a family traveling with luggage and supplies. James followed the tracks for 200 yards before they disappeared entirely under fresh snow accumulation. But the direction was clear, and it led toward the most remote section of the search area, a network of logging roads that hadn't been maintained for regular traffic in over 5 years. The Cherokee handled the rough terrain with the confidence that James had built into every mechanical system. But even with superior equipment, progress was slow. Fallen branches blocked portions of the road, forcing him to clear passage with the chainsaw he carried for exactly such obstacles. Snow drifts reached heights that required careful navigation to avoid getting stuck in areas where no other rescue vehicle could reach him. 20 minutes into this section of the search, James saw something that made him stop the Cherokee and step out into the storm. A reflection, barely visible through the snow, but definitely metallic and too regular to be natural. He approached on foot, his medical bag slung over his shoulder and his flashlight cutting through the darkness that had settled over the mountains. The minivan sat at an angle across what had once been a road, its outline softened by snow accumulation, but unmistakably the vehicle described in the missing persons report. No lights were visible from the interior, and no heat signature showed around the exhaust pipe. James felt his stomach tighten as he realized what this likely meant about the vehicle's fuel situation. He approached the driver's side window and used his flashlight to peer inside. What he saw made him immediately shift into emergency medical mode, while simultaneously feeling a wave of relief that he hadn't expected. 4 small faces were visible in the back seat, bundled together under blankets, their breathing creating small fog patterns on the cold windows. Alive, but clearly suffering from prolonged exposure to dropping temperatures. The driver's seat held a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, her dark hair framing a face that showed the strain of several hours spent managing a crisis. While trying to protect her children, she was awake, alert, and watching him with the careful wariness of someone who had been hoping for rescue, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that help might not arrive. James tapped gently on the window and held up his medical bag, pointing to the identification badge that marked him as a licensed physician. The woman's expression shifted from wariness to desperate relief as she fumbled with the door locks. "Dr. Growfeather," James introduced himself as the door opened, cold air rushing into the vehicle's interior. "I'm with the search and rescue team. Are you or your children injured?" "Victoria Chen," she replied, her voice hoarse from hours of talking, to keep her children calm. "We're not injured," But we've been here for over 2 hours without heat. The kids are getting so cold, and I don't know how much longer. You did exactly the right thing by conserving fuel, James interrupted, already assessing the children's condition through the systematic approach his medical training had made. Automatic. Pink cheeks suggested adequate circulation. Responsive to voices meant their core temperatures hadn't dropped to dangerous levels, and the fact that they were alert and looking at him with curiosity rather than lethargy indicated they were still well within safe parameters for cold exposure. But James also recognized how quickly that could change. November temperatures in this region could drop to life-threatening levels within hours once the sun disappeared completely, and these children had been exposed to gradually decreasing temperatures for too long to remain stable much longer. "I'm going to get you all out of here," James said, making it sound like a simple statement of fact rather than the complex logistical challenge he knew it would be. "But first, I need to make sure everyone is warm and stable for travel." James returned to his Cherokee and retrieved equipment he had hoped he wouldn't need. Emergency thermal blankets designed for hypothermia treatment, portable heating pads that operated on battery power, and high-energy food supplies that could help raise core body temperatures. He also grabbed the emergency radio that would allow him to coordinate with other search teams. "Search base, this is Cherokee 1, James spoke into the radio as he organized his supplies. "I have located the missing family, 4 children and 1 adult, all alive and responsive. Location is Forest Service Road 294, approximately 2 miles north of the main junction. Preparing for immediate evacuation." The response crackled through static and wind noise, but James caught the essential information. Road conditions between his location and the nearest medical facility were deteriorating rapidly. Additional snowfall was expected throughout the night, and several access routes had become impassable even for emergency vehicles. James looked at the minivan, then at his Cherokee, and realized that his original plan of guiding the family back to safety in their own vehicle was no longer viable. The minivan's fuel situation made it unreliable for the difficult journey ahead, and the road conditions required the specialized equipment his Cherokee possessed. But his Cherokee was designed for emergency medical transport, not for moving 5 people through mountain terrain during a blizzard. James would need to make modifications to his rescue plan, and those modifications would test both his medical skills and his understanding of survival in conditions that were becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. "Mrs. Chen," James said, returning to the minivan with his medical supplies, "I need to ask you to trust me on something that might seem unusual. Your van doesn't have enough fuel to make it out of here safely, and these roads are getting worse every hour. I'm going to move all of you to my vehicle, but it's going to be a tight fit, and the journey is going to take longer than any of us would prefer." Victoria looked at her children, then back at James, and he could see her making the same calculation he had made. They could stay with the familiar comfort of their own vehicle and hope that conditions would improve, or they could trust a stranger to guide them through terrain that was becoming more treacherous with every hour that passed. "What do you need us to do?" Victoria asked, and James heard in her voice the kind of determined courage that he had learned to recognize in people who would do whatever was necessary to protect their families. James began the process of transferring the Chen family to his Cherokee, working with the systematic efficiency that emergency medicine had taught him. Each child was wrapped in thermal blankets and moved individually, with James carrying them through snow that had deepened significantly since his arrival. Victoria gathered essential supplies from their minivan, medications, identification, and the few personal items that might provide comfort during what was going to be a challenging journey. The Cherokee's interior had been modified for medical transport, with fold-down seating and equipment storage that could accommodate patients in various conditions. But fitting 4 small children and their mother into a space designed for emergency medical work required creative arrangement of people and equipment. Emma and Ethan, the more adventurous of the quadruplets, treated the transfer as an exciting development in their adventure. Olivia and Noah required more reassurance, but the warmth of the Cherokee's heating system and the presence of their mother in the same vehicle helped them settle into the cramped but secure space. James completed a final check of the minivan, ensuring that no essential items had been left behind and that the vehicle was positioned safely for eventual recovery once weather conditions improved. He also left emergency markers that would help other search teams locate the abandoned vehicle and understand that the family had been successfully rescued. As James prepared to begin the journey back to civilization, he looked at the 5 people, now depending on his knowledge of these mountains and his ability to navigate conditions that would challenge even experienced wilderness travelers. The easy part of the rescue was complete. Now came the test of whether his Cherokee, his skills, and his understanding of mountain weather could deliver the Chen family safely through what was shaping up to be one of the most severe November storms in recent memory. The radio crackled with updates from other search teams, and James realized that they had become part of a larger emergency situation. 2 other vehicles had been reported missing in the region, and weather conditions were making standard rescue operations increasingly difficult. The Chen family rescue had become a race not just against hypothermia, but against a storm system that seemed determined to test every aspect of mountain survival expertise. The Cherokee's engine growled to life with the reassuring rumble of machinery, built for harsh conditions, but James knew that mechanical reliability would only carry them so far. The real challenge lay in the 15 miles of deteriorating mountain roads between their current location and the relative safety of the valley below. What should have been a 30-minute drive under normal conditions would now require at least 2 hours of careful navigation through terrain that was actively trying to kill them. Victoria sat in the front passenger seat, her body twisted to maintain visual contact with all 4 children crammed into the Cherokee's modified rear compartment. The thermal blankets James had provided were working. She could see color returning to faces that had been pale with cold, but the cramped conditions were already testing the limits of 4-year-old patience. "How far do we have to go?" Emma asked, her voice muffled by the layers of emergency blankets wrapped around her small frame. "Not too far, sweetheart," Victoria replied, though she caught James's slight shake of the head that suggested the journey would be more complicated than simple distance measurements could convey. James engaged the Cherokee's 4-wheel drive system and began the slow process of backing away from the abandoned minivan. The vehicle's enhanced suspension handled the rough terrain, but progress was measured in careful increments rather than steady forward motion. Every few yards required assessment of snow depth, evaluation of traction conditions, and decisions about route selection that could mean the difference between safe passage and catastrophic delay. The first major obstacle appeared within 10 minutes of departure. A pine tree, weakened by previous storms and finally felled by the current wind conditions, lay directly across their intended path. The trunk was too large to drive over and too heavy to move by hand, but going around it meant leaving the established road surface for terrain that might not support the Cherokee's weight. James stopped the vehicle and studied the situation through windows that required constant clearing as snow accumulated faster than the wipers could handle. He had encountered similar obstacles during previous rescues, but never with 5 passengers depending on his decisions, and never in conditions where mistakes could prove fatal within hours rather than days. "I need to check something," James told Victoria, pulling on heavy gloves and adjusting the hood of his emergency parka. "Keep the engine running and the heat on. This might take a few minutes." Outside, the storm had evolved into something beyond normal weather patterns. Wind speeds that had been concerning an hour earlier were now reaching levels that made standing upright a conscious effort. Snow wasn't falling so much as being hurled horizontally through air that felt sharp against exposed skin. James had to lean into the wind to maintain balance as he examined their options. The fallen tree stretched across 20 feet of roadway, its root system creating an additional barrier on one side. Going around meant navigating a slope that dropped toward what James remembered as a seasonal creek, now likely filled with snow-covered rocks that could destroy the Cherokee's undercarriage. But attempting to move the tree was equally risky. The effort would consume time and energy they couldn't afford to waste. James made a decision that combined calculated risk with the kind of mountain wisdom his grandmother had spent years teaching him. Rather than going around the tree, he would go through the forest beside it, using a path that game animals had worn over decades of seasonal migration. The path was narrow and steep, but it offered solid ground beneath the snow and connected back to the road system beyond the obstacle. Returning to the Cherokee, James found Victoria trying to manage a minor crisis among the children. Noah had begun crying from the discomfort of the cramped seating arrangement, which had triggered sympathetic distress from Olivia, which had in turn prompted Ethan to demand that everyone stop being babies. Only Emma remained calm, though James could see the worry in her eyes as she looked toward the front windshield, where snow continued to accumulate despite the vehicle's heating system. "Change of plans," James announced, adjusting his rearview mirror to make eye contact with all four children. "We're going to take a little detour through the forest. It's going to feel like a roller coaster for a few minutes, but the Cherokee is built for this kind of adventure." James had learned that presenting challenges to children as adventures rather than dangers often made the difference between cooperation and panic. The quadruplets responded exactly as he had hoped, with Emma asking if they might see deer, and Ethan wondering if the Cherokee could climb trees like a monster truck. The forest path tested every modification James had made to his vehicle over the years. The Cherokee tilted at angles that felt precarious but remained within safe parameters, its enhanced suspension absorbing impacts from hidden rocks and fallen branches. Progress was slow, measured more in successful navigation of individual obstacles than in distance covered, but they were moving towards safety rather than remaining static targets for a storm that showed no signs of weakening. Victoria gripped the door handle and tried to project calm confidence for her children's benefit, but James could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she monitored each sound the vehicle made. She was calculating odds and outcomes with the systematic anxiety of someone who had learned that life could change catastrophically without warning. "Tell me about your mother's cabin," James said, partly to gather information that might be useful for their rescue, but mostly to give Victoria something to focus on besides the Cherokee's precarious movement through terrain that hadn't been designed for vehicle traffic. Victoria began describing Eleanor's property, the way morning light streamed through windows that faced east toward the peaks, the wood-burning stove that could heat the entire cabin, the field where her mother grew vegetables during the short mountain growing season. As she talked, James heard her voice steady and strengthen, the act of describing familiar comfort helping her manage the stress of their current situation. But James was also listening for practical details. Eleanor's cabin sat at approximately 8,500 feet elevation, accessible by a county-maintained road that connected to Highway 285 about 12 miles south of Kenosha Pass. If the storm had affected that area similarly to their current location, Eleanor might also be dealing with emergency conditions. The Cherokee emerged from the forest path onto what appeared to be the continuation of Forest Service Road 294, though snow accumulation made positive identification difficult. James consulted his GPS, but satellite reception remained unreliable, leaving him to navigate by compass bearing and his accumulated knowledge of the regional road system. They had covered approximately 5 miles from the rescue site, with roughly 10 miles remaining to reach the relative safety of the main valley. But James could feel the Cherokee working harder with each mile, the engine straining against conditions that were pushing every mechanical system toward its operational limits. That's when the radio crackled with information that changed everything. About their rescue timeline. "All units, this is Search Base," the dispatcher's voice cut through static and wind noise. "We have confirmation of complete road closure on Highway 285 between mile markers 203 and 218. Multiple vehicle accidents, power lines down, and at least 3 additional missing persons reports. Emergency shelters are being activated in Bailey and Conifer. Repeat, Highway 285 is closed indefinitely." James felt his stomach drop as he processed the implications. Highway 285 was their primary evacuation route, the road that connected this mountain region to medical facilities and emergency services in the Denver metro area. With that route closed, they were effectively cut off from standard rescue support, until weather conditions improved enough for helicopter evacuation, or until road crews could clear the major obstacles. Victoria heard the radio transmission and looked at James with the kind of direct question that demanded an honest answer. "What does that mean for us?" James made a quick calculation based on fuel remaining, distance to alternative routes, and weather projections he had heard throughout the day. Their situation had shifted from difficult to potentially critical, but they still had options that didn't require panic or desperation. "It means we're going to take the scenic route," James replied, managing to inject a note of confidence into his voice that he didn't entirely feel. "There's another way out of these mountains, but it's going to take longer and require some patience from everyone." The alternative route James had in mind would add at least 30 miles to their journey, most of it on secondary roads that received minimal maintenance even under normal conditions. But it would also take them through areas where James had grown up, terrain he knew with the kind of intimate familiarity that could compensate for deteriorating visibility and dangerous weather. More importantly, the alternative route would take them past his grandmother's old property, where a cabin still stood that could provide emergency shelter if the Cherokee encountered mechanical problems or if weather conditions became too dangerous for continued travel. James hadn't mentioned the shelter option to Victoria because he hoped it wouldn't become necessary. But the knowledge that refuge existed along their route provided him with the confidence to attempt what would otherwise be an unreasonably risky journey through mountain terrain during a major storm. The Cherokee continued its methodical progress, through snow that had deepened to over 18 inches in many areas. James found himself driving more by feel than by sight, using the vehicle's mechanical feedback to determine road surface conditions and the presence of obstacles that weren't visible until they were directly ahead. Behind them, the Quadruplets had settled into the rhythm of the journey, their earlier anxiety replaced by the kind of adaptive acceptance that children often demonstrated in situations where adults remained tense and worried. Emma had begun a quiet singing game that the others joined, their voices providing a soundtrack of resilience that seemed to push back against the storm's relentless assault. Victoria found herself marveling at James's steady competence behind the wheel, the way he seemed to read terrain and weather conditions with an intuitive understanding that went beyond standard driving skills. She realized that her family's survival depended entirely on this stranger's knowledge and judgment, and that recognition brought with it a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability that she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. As they navigated another series of switchbacks that took them gradually downward toward what James promised was a more stable road system, Victoria began to allow herself the possibility that they might actually reach safety. The children were warm, The Cherokee was performing reliably, and their rescuer projected the kind of calm authority that suggested extensive experience with exactly this type of emergency. But the mountain wasn't finished testing their resolve. Ahead, barely visible through the driving snow, a bridge crossed what was normally a small creek, but had swollen with snowmelt and storm runoff into something approaching a minor river. The bridge was old, built for logging operations decades earlier, and showed signs of structural stress that made James question whether it could support the Cherokee's weight under current conditions. James stopped the vehicle and sat studying the bridge while calculating options that were becoming increasingly limited. Behind him, 4 children waited trustingly for adult decisions that would determine whether their adventure story had a happy ending. The bridge stretched across 30 feet of churning water that had transformed from a peaceful mountain creek into something altogether more menacing. James studied the wooden structure through the Cherokee's windshield, noting the way certain planks sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The bridge had been built in the 1970s for logging trucks, but 40 years of mountain weather had taken their toll on timber that now showed gaps between boards and support beams that creaked audibly even over the storm's howling. James turned off the engine and stepped into the blizzard, immediately feeling the wind try to push him sideways as he approached the bridge on foot. Each step across the wooden planks produced sounds that made him increasingly concerned about structural integrity. The creek below had swollen to nearly twice its normal width, fed by snowmelt and storm runoff that created currents strong enough to sweep away anything that fell from the deteriorating span. Returning to the Cherokee, James found Victoria watching him with an expression that demanded straightforward information rather than reassuring platitudes. Behind her, the quadruplets had grown quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere that adults experienced when facing genuinely dangerous decisions. "The bridge will probably hold us," James said, emphasizing the word probably in a way that made clear he was sharing his honest assessment rather than offering false confidence. "But if it doesn't, we'll end up in water that's moving too fast and too cold for anyone to survive." Victoria looked at the bridge, then at her children, and James could see her making calculations that no parent should have to make. Risk the crossing and potentially lose everyone, or stay where they were and hope that rescue would arrive before hypothermia became the greater threat. "What's the alternative?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected there might not be one. James had been considering exactly that question during his bridge inspection. Backtracking would mean returning through terrain they had already struggled to navigate, using fuel they couldn't spare, and losing precious hours of remaining daylight. Going around the creek would require finding another crossing point that might not exist, or attempting to ford the swollen waterway at a location that could prove even more dangerous than the damaged bridge. "There's another option," James said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke, "but it means spending the night in the mountains instead of trying to reach the valley tonight." James explained about his grandmother's cabin, located approximately 2 miles from their current position via a route that didn't require crossing the bridge. The cabin had been abandoned for 5 years since his grandmother's death, but James had maintained the structure and kept it stocked with emergency supplies for exactly this type of situation. They could reach the cabin safely, wait out the worst of the storm, and continue their journey in the morning when visibility and road conditions would be significantly improved. Victoria felt something approaching relief as she considered this alternative. The idea of spending several more hours in the Cherokee, cramped together, while James navigated increasingly dangerous terrain in complete darkness, had been generating anxiety that she had been trying to hide from her children. A warm, secure shelter where they could rest and recover from the day's ordeal sounded almost too good to be possible. "Is there food?" Emma asked from the back seat, her practical 4-year-old mind focusing on the detail that mattered most to her immediate. Comfort. Plenty of food, James confirmed, and Victoria heard genuine warmth in his voice as he addressed her daughter's concern. My grandmother always believed in being prepared for unexpected guests. The route to the cabin required backtracking only, half a mile before branching onto what James described as a traditional trail that had been used by his grandmother's family for generations. The path was narrow and steep in places, but it had been designed for travelers moving through mountain terrain during harsh weather, and it offered natural windbreaks that provided relief from the storm's constant assault. James engaged the Cherokees, lowest gear, and began the careful ascent toward the cabin. The trail was exactly as he had described, challenging but manageable for a vehicle with proper equipment and an experienced driver. Victoria found herself relaxing for the first time since the morning, no longer calculating disaster scenarios, but instead beginning to believe that her family might emerge from this ordeal with nothing worse than an adventure story to tell for years to come. The quadruplets responded to the improved atmosphere by returning to their earlier chatter about the day's events. Noah had decided that Dr. Crowfeather was probably a superhero disguised as a regular person. Olivia wanted to know if they would see the cabin where the doctor's grandmother had lived. Ethan was planning to tell everyone at school about riding in a real rescue truck. Emma remained focused on the food situation, asking detailed questions about what types of meals might be available. James found himself smiling at the children's resilience and adaptability. In his years as an emergency physician, he had learned that children often handled crisis situations better than adults, their natural optimism and trust in adult competence serving as emotional armor against circumstances that would overwhelm. More sophisticated understanding. The cabin appeared through the storm like something from a fairy tale, its log construction and steep-pitched roof designed to shed snow while maintaining structural integrity under the weight of mountain winters. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, but warm light glowed from windows that suggested the building's electrical system remained functional despite years of limited use. James parked the Cherokee beside the cabin's covered porch and turned to face his passengers with the expression of someone delivering genuinely good news. Welcome to Grandmother Crowfeather's hospitality. She would have been honored to provide shelter for a family in need. The transfer from vehicle to cabin took only minutes, but those minutes provided Victoria with her first clear sense of just how severe the storm had become. Wind speeds that had seemed dangerous from inside the Cherokee proved to be approaching the limits of what humans could navigate safely. Snow wasn't falling but being driven horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin and make breathing difficult. Inside, the cabin revealed itself as a masterpiece of practical mountain living. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and living areas around a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Furniture was sturdy and comfortable, built for people who understood that mountain winters required both durability and coziness. Windows provided views of the surrounding forest when weather permitted, but tonight they showed only the white chaos of the continuing blizzard. James moved through the cabin with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in space, checking electrical systems, adjusting the thermostat, and beginning the process of transforming a cold building into a warm refuge. The furnace responded immediately, filling the cabin with the sound of circulating air and the promise of steadily increasing warmth. Victoria helped her children remove their outer layers and settle into the main room, while James disappeared into what appeared to be a well-stocked kitchen. The quadruplets were fascinated by their surroundings, examining furniture and decorations with the careful curiosity that children brought to new environments. "Look, Mommy," Emma called from beside a bookshelf, filled with what appeared to be hand-bound volumes. These books have pictures of people in old-fashioned clothes. Victoria joined her daughter and found herself looking at photograph albums that chronicled decades of family history. Pictures showed gatherings of people whose faces carried the distinctive features of Native American heritage, celebrations that took place in settings that ranged from traditional to contemporary, and landscapes that were clearly the same mountains where they now sought shelter. "Those are my grandmother's family records," James said, appearing from the kitchen with mugs of hot chocolate that sent steam curling toward the cabin's log ceiling. She believed that stories should be preserved for the generations that would follow. James distributed the hot chocolate and began explaining about the cabin's history while Victoria's children settled around the fireplace with the contentment of people who had found safety after hours of uncertainty. The building had been constructed by his great-grandfather in the 1920s, expanded by subsequent generations, and maintained as a family gathering place until his grandmother's death had left James as the sole inheritor. "She used to say that mountains chose the people who belonged with them," James continued, adding wood to the fireplace and adjusting the damper to optimize heat output. "She would have said that this storm brought you here because the cabin needed to fulfill its purpose again." Victoria found herself drawn into the warmth of both the physical space and the cultural traditions that James described. She had grown up in suburban environments where connections to place and family history were maintained through annual gatherings and digital photo sharing rather than through the kind of intimate relationship with landscape that the cabin represented. But she also found herself wondering about James himself. His decision to maintain this remote property, his solitary work as a mountain physician, and the way he moved between modern medical practice and traditional wisdom with an ease that suggested deep comfort with both worlds. "Do you live here?" Olivia asked, voicing the question that Victoria had been considering. "Sometimes," James replied, "when the mountains call for company or when people need help that can only be provided here." James prepared a meal that combined ingredients from the cabin's emergency supplies with techniques that produced far more sophisticated results than Victoria had expected possible under the circumstances. Venison stew with vegetables that had been preserved using methods his grandmother had taught him, cornbread baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven that had probably seen decades of similar use, and herbal tea made from plants that grew wild in the surrounding forest. The quadruplets ate with the enthusiasm of children who had worked up genuine appetites through their day of adventure. But Victoria noticed that each of them also kept checking to ensure that she was still present and safe. The day's events had reminded them that security could disappear without warning, and they were maintaining closer emotional contact with their mother than their usual independence would suggest. As the evening settled around them and the storm continued its assault on the cabin's walls and windows, Victoria realized that she felt more peaceful than she had since Michael's death. Not because their situation was completely safe, they were still stranded in mountain terrain during dangerous weather, but because for the first time in months, someone else was taking responsibility for her family's welfare and proving competent to handle that responsibility. James built up the fire to last through the night and began arranging sleeping accommodations that would keep everyone warm and comfortable until morning. The cabin had been designed for extended family gatherings, with sleeping space that could accommodate the temporary crowding their situation required. "Tomorrow, the storm will break," James said, with the confidence of someone whose weather predictions came from sources more reliable than meteorological forecasting. "We'll reach the valley easily, and your mother will have the best Thanksgiving story she's heard in years." Victoria looked at her children, already drowsing in the warmth and security of the cabin, and realized that James was probably right. But she also realized that returning to their normal lives would now include the memory of this night, when a stranger had provided not just rescue, but genuine hospitality in circumstances that had tested every assumption she held about her ability to protect her family. Outside, the blizzard continued with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, 5 people who had been strangers that morning were sharing the kind of trust and comfort that usually required years to develop. The storm had brought them together, but something deeper was keeping them safe. Victoria woke to absolute silence. After hours of listening to wind battering the cabin walls and snow scratching against windows like persistent claws, the sudden absence of storm sounds felt almost unnatural. Pale morning light filtered through frost-covered glass, creating patterns that suggested the blizzard had finally exhausted itself sometime during the night. She found herself alone on the couch, where James had arranged blankets and pillows with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary sleeping arrangements comfortable. The quadruplets were still bundled together in the cabin's single bedroom, their breathing creating a soft rhythm that indicated deep, peaceful sleep. James was nowhere visible, though the lingering warmth from the fireplace suggested he had been maintaining it throughout the night. Victoria wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders and moved to the window, carefully clearing a section of frost to peer outside. What she saw took her breath away. The storm had transformed the landscape into something from a fantasy illustration. Trees bent under snow loads that created sculptures of white and shadow, ground drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's windows, and a sky that had cleared to reveal peaks that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. The Cherokee sat buried under snow accumulation that would have made yesterday's journey impossible, but Victoria could see that James had already begun the process of digging it out. Fresh tracks led from the vehicle to a storage shed she hadn't noticed the previous evening, and she could hear sounds that suggested someone working with tools and equipment. "Magnificent, isn't it?" James's voice came from behind her, causing Victoria to turn and find him standing in the cabin's doorway with an armload of firewood and an expression of quiet satisfaction. "I've never seen anything like it," Victoria replied, and realized that she meant more than just the transformed landscape. She had never experienced the kind of peace that came from surviving genuine danger, from discovering that she could depend on someone else's competence when her own resources proved insufficient. James built up the fire and began preparing breakfast, with the same unhurried efficiency he had demonstrated the previous evening. Coffee that filled the cabin with rich aromas, pancakes made from ingredients that seemed impossibly fresh, considering their remote location, and maple syrup that James mentioned came from trees on the property. "How long have you been awake?" Victoria asked, settling at the kitchen table where she could maintain visual contact with the bedroom where her children continued sleeping. "Mountain habit," James replied with a slight smile. "Dawn is when you assess what the night has left behind and make plans for what the day will require." Victoria found herself studying James's face in the morning light, noting details that the previous day's crisis hadn't allowed her to observe. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his early 50s, with features that combined European and Native American heritage in ways that suggested generations of family history in this region. His hands moved with the precision of someone whose profession required fine motor control, but they also showed the calluses and scars of someone who worked regularly with tools and outdoor equipment. "Tell me about your grandmother," Victoria said, gesturing toward the photograph albums that still sat open from the previous evening's exploration. James poured coffee and settled across from her at the table, his expression shifting into the reflective mood that people adopted when sharing family stories that mattered to them. His grandmother, Sarah Crow Feather, had been born in 1923 and lived her entire life in these mountains. She had worked as a midwife and traditional healer, serving both the Native American community and the growing population of settlers who recognized her knowledge and skills. She delivered over 300 babies during her career, James continued, including me. She used to say that mountains chose the people who belonged with them, and that her job was to help those people find their way safely into the world. Victoria learned that James had spent every summer of his childhood at this cabin, learning skills that combined traditional knowledge with practical mountain living. His grandmother had taught him to read weather patterns, to understand how plants and animals responded to seasonal changes, and to navigate terrain using landmarks that most people would never notice. But she had also insisted that he pursue formal education, understanding that the modern world would require credentials and certifications that traditional knowledge alone couldn't provide. James had completed medical school at the University of Colorado, specialized in emergency medicine, and returned to these mountains with a combination of skills that made him uniquely qualified for the kind of rescue work he now performed. The conversation was interrupted by sounds from the bedroom that indicated the quadruplets were beginning to wake up. Victoria heard Emma's voice asking where they were, followed by Ethan's declaration that he was hungry, and then the general, stirring that preceded the morning chaos that 4-year-olds could generate within minutes of achieving consciousness. James rose from the table and began setting out plates and utensils with the anticipatory efficiency of someone who understood that hungry children required immediate attention. Victoria found herself marveling at his natural ease with family dynamics, the way he seemed to understand what needed to be done without requiring explanation or direction. The children emerged from the bedroom in various states of sleepy confusion, each requiring individual reassurance about their location and circumstances before they could focus on the breakfast that James was arranging. Emma wanted to know if they were still lost. Ethan demanded to see the snow. Olivia asked when they would go home. Noah simply climbed onto Victoria's lap and buried his face in her shoulder. "We are not lost anymore," Victoria explained, gathering her children around the table where James was serving pancakes that looked professionally prepared. "Dr. Crowfeather brought us to his grandmother's cabin, and today we're going to continue our journey to Grandma Eleanor's house." The explanation seemed to satisfy most concerns, especially when combined with maple syrup and the kind of focused attention that James provided to each child's questions about their surroundings. Emma was fascinated by the photograph albums and wanted to hear stories about the people in the pictures. Ethan was planning to build snow forts once they went outside. Olivia had decided that the cabin was like a fairy tale house and wanted to know if they could visit again. James answered each question with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed talking with children, but Victoria could see that he was also monitoring weather conditions through the windows and making mental calculations about their departure timeline. "The roads will be passable in about 2 hours, James announced, after completing what appeared to be a systematic assessment of outdoor conditions. "That will give us time to prepare properly and ensure that everyone is ready for what should be a much easier journey than yesterday's adventure." Victoria felt a mixture of relief and unexpected reluctance as she processed this information. Relief because reaching her mother's cabin would complete their original travel plans and restore some sense of normal family routine, but reluctance because returning to their regular lives would mean leaving behind the unique intimacy that crisis situations could create between people who might otherwise remain strangers. James began the process of preparing for departure with the systematic approach that Victoria had learned to associate with his handling of complex situations. Equipment was checked and organized, emergency supplies were replenished, and the Cherokee was cleared of snow accumulation that had reached impressive depths during the night. The children helped with preparations according to their abilities. carrying small items and generally treating the departure process as an extension of their adventure, rather than the conclusion of an emergency situation. Victoria found herself taking mental photographs of scenes that she wanted to remember. Emma carefully arranging supplies in the Cherokee's cargo area, Ethan asking James detailed questions about how snow chains worked, Olivia and Noah playing in snowdrifts that reached above their heads. But she also found herself thinking about practical matters that would need attention once they returned to normal life. Her minivan was still abandoned on a Forest Service road, probably buried under snow and requiring professional recovery services. Insurance claims would need to be filed, travel plans would need to be rearranged, and she would need to explain to her mother why they had arrived a day late with stories that sounded almost too dramatic to be believable. More complex were the questions about how this experience would change the assumptions she had been making about her ability to manage single parenthood without accepting help from others. For 8 months, she had been determined to prove that she could handle every challenge that life presented to her family. Yesterday demonstrated that some challenges exceeded individual capabilities, regardless of determination or preparation. "Mrs. Chen," James said, appearing beside her while she stood watching her children play in the snow. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you before we continue our journey." Victoria turned to face him, noting the serious expression that suggested he had been considering whatever he was about to say for some time. "Your mother's cabin is still another 40 miles from here, and some of those roads might not be cleared for several more hours," James began. "I've been thinking that it might make sense for me to accompany you all the way there, just to ensure that you don't encounter any additional problems." Victoria felt her initial impulse to decline politely, to insist that she could manage the remainder of the journey without further assistance. But she also remembered the previous day's lesson about the difference between independence and foolish pride. "I would appreciate that very much," Victoria replied, and realized that accepting help was becoming easier with practice. James nodded with the expression of someone whose offer had been accepted in the spirit it was intended. "Besides," he added, with a slight smile, "I've never met anyone who could make hot chocolate as good as what I've heard Eleanor Chen is famous for. This seems like an excellent opportunity to expand my cultural education." Victoria laughed, feeling some of the emotional tension that had been building around their departure beginning to dissolve. The journey to her mother's cabin would continue as a shared adventure rather than a return to the isolation that had characterized so much of her life since Michael's death. James completed his final preparations for departure, while Victoria helped her children gather their belongings and prepare for what would hopefully be the final leg of their journey. The Cherokee had been transformed from an emergency rescue vehicle back into comfortable transportation, though Victoria noticed that James maintained the same careful attention to safety and emergency preparedness that had characterized their previous day's travel. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Victoria took one final look around the space that had provided shelter during the worst of the storm. The fireplace still glowed with coals that would probably remain warm for hours. The photograph albums lay open on tables where James's family history was displayed. And everything about the room suggested the kind of permanence and stability that she had been seeking without fully realizing it. "Thank you," Victoria said to James, though she knew that the words were inadequate for expressing what his rescue and hospitality had meant to her family. "Grandmother would say that the mountain brought you here for reasons that go beyond what we can see immediately," James replied. "She would also say that some journeys are about reaching your destination, but others are about discovering what you carry with you along the way." Victoria settled into the Cherokee's passenger seat, while James secured the last of their supplies and completed his final check of the cabin. Behind her, 4 children chattered excitedly about continuing their adventure, unaware that they were Participants in a story that would reshape their mother's understanding of what it meant to accept help and trust others with the welfare of people she loved most in the world. The road to Eleanor's cabin wound through terrain that had been completely transformed by the storm's aftermath. What had been treacherous mountain passages the previous day now revealed themselves as corridors of stunning beauty, with snow-laden pine branches creating natural archways and crystal formations that caught morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. The Cherokee moved steadily through conditions that were challenging but manageable, James navigating with the confidence of someone whose understanding of these mountains went beyond simple familiarity. Victoria found herself relaxing into the passenger seat in ways that surprised her. For months, she had been the sole decision-maker for every aspect of her family's daily existence, carrying the constant weight of choices that could affect 4 young lives. Having someone else handle navigation, assess road conditions, and make the tactical decisions that safe travel required felt like a luxury she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Behind them, the quadruplets had settled into the journey with the adaptability that Victoria had learned to both admire and depend upon. Emma was maintaining a running commentary on the scenery, pointing out formations that looked like animals or castles to her siblings. Ethan had appointed himself as the official wildlife spotter, convinced that deer or elk might appear at any moment. Olivia and Noah were sharing a tablet, absorbed in educational games that kept them quietly occupied while still allowing them to participate in family conversation. "Tell me about your mother," James said, his tone carrying the genuine interest that Victoria had noticed he brought to most personal topics. "What should I know before I meet the famous Eleanor Chen?" Victoria smiled as she considered how to describe her mother to someone who would be meeting her for the first time under these unusual circumstances. Eleanor was 72 years old, a retired high school English teacher who had moved to the mountains 15 years earlier, seeking the kind of peaceful retirement that suburban Denver couldn't provide. She was fiercely independent, remarkably well-read, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of managing teenage students and raising her own family through various challenges. "She's going to interrogate you," Victoria warned with affection in her voice. "Not in a hostile way, but she'll want to know everything about how you found us, what your qualifications are, and whether you can be trusted with her family's welfare. She's been protective of us since Michael died, probably more protective than I've wanted to admit." Victoria explained that Eleanor had been urging her to move to the mountains permanently, arguing that the children would benefit from clean air, outdoor activities, and the kind of close-knit community that mountain towns could provide. Victoria had resisted these suggestions, partly because her life and career were established in Denver, but mostly because accepting her mother's help felt like admitting that she couldn't manage single parenthood independently. "Yesterday might have changed my perspective on accepting help," Victoria added, glancing at James with an expression that carried both gratitude and the kind of vulnerability that came from reconsidering long-held assumptions about self-reliance. James navigated a particularly challenging series of switchbacks while processing this information. He had encountered many families during emergency situations, and he had learned to recognize the difference between people who were temporarily overwhelmed by circumstances and those who were carrying burdens that exceeded their long-term capacity to manage alone. Victoria's situation seemed to fall into the latter category, though he suspected she was only beginning to acknowledge that reality. "Mountain communities have their own ways of supporting families," James said carefully, offering perspective without seeming to give unsolicited advice. "People understand that individual strength and community support aren't contradictory concepts. They're complementary approaches to handling whatever life brings." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's excited announcement that she could see smoke rising from a chimney ahead of them. Victoria felt her heart rate increase as she realized they were approaching the final destination of their extended journey. Eleanor's cabin sat on a ridge that provided spectacular views of the surrounding peaks, and smoke from the wood-burning stove meant that her mother was awake and probably preparing for their arrival. Eleanor Chen appeared on her front porch before the Cherokee had completed its turn into the cabin's driveway. She was a small woman whose physical stature was offset by the kind of commanding presence that decades of teaching had developed, and Victoria could see immediately that her mother was assessing the situation with the systematic attention to detail that characterized her approach to any unexpected development. The Cherokee had barely stopped moving before Eleanor was approaching the driver's side window, her expression combining relief with curiosity and a hint of the protective suspicion that Victoria had predicted. James stepped out of the vehicle and introduced himself with the respectful formality that seemed appropriate for meeting the grandmother of the family he had rescued. "Dr. Crow Feather," Eleanor repeated, shaking hands with the grip that Victoria remembered from her childhood, firm enough to convey strength and confidence, but not aggressive. "I assume there's quite a story behind why you're delivering my family instead of them arriving in their own vehicle." "Yes, ma'am, there is," James replied, with the patience of someone who understood that family dynamics required careful navigation. "And it's a story that reflects very well on your daughter's judgment and your grandchildren's courage." Victoria supervised the process of extracting 4 excited children from the Cherokee's back seat, while listening to James provide Eleanor with a concise but comprehensive summary of the previous day's events. She noticed that his account emphasized the decisions Victoria had made correctly rather than the mistakes that had led to their emergency, and that he described the children's behavior in terms that highlighted their resilience and cooperation. Eleanor listened with the focused attention that Victoria remembered from childhood conversations about school problems or social challenges. Her mother had always possessed the ability to gather information efficiently while simultaneously assessing the emotional undercurrents that might not be explicitly stated. "Victoria," Eleanor said, turning to embrace her daughter with a fierce hug that conveyed relief, love, and probably some carefully controlled anger about risks that had been taken. "I'm proud of how you handled a dangerous situation, and I'm grateful that Dr. Crow Feather was available to provide assistance when you needed it." The embrace lasted longer than Eleanor's usual demonstrations of affection, and Victoria realized that her mother had been more worried about their delayed arrival than she had initially revealed. Eleanor had probably spent hours considering possible explanations for why her family hadn't arrived on schedule, and most of those explanations would have involved scenarios too frightening to discuss with anyone. "Now," Eleanor continued, stepping back and resuming the practical tone that Victoria associated with her mother's approach to managing complex situations, "everyone needs to come inside where it's warm, and Dr. Crow Feather needs to stay for lunch so we can hear this story properly, and I can thank him appropriately for bringing my family home safely." James began to demur, mentioning other responsibilities and the need to begin his return journey while road conditions remained favorable. But Eleanor deployed the kind of insistent hospitality that Victoria remembered from childhood, the approach that made declining an invitation seem not just rude, but practically impossible. "Dr. Crow Feather," Eleanor said with the tone she had probably used to manage reluctant students, "you spent the night ensuring that my family remained safe and comfortable. The least I can do is provide you with a proper meal and the kind of conversation that will help me understand exactly what happened and what I owe you for your kindness." Victoria found herself smiling as she watched James surrender to Eleanor's determination with the graceful acceptance of someone who recognized when resistance would be futile. Her mother had a gift for making people feel that accepting her hospitality was actually a favor they were doing for her, rather than an imposition on their time and energy. Eleanor's cabin was larger and more modern than James's grandmother's place, but it shared the same sense of being designed for comfort and practical mountain living. The main room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of snow-covered peaks, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire structure, and furniture arranged to encourage conversation and family gatherings. The Quadruplets immediately began exploring their familiar surroundings with the enthusiasm of children who had missed favorite toys and games during their adventure. Eleanor had prepared for their visit by arranging activities and treats that she knew would capture their attention. But Victoria noticed that her mother was also observing the children carefully, probably assessing whether their experience had affected them in ways that might require additional attention. "They seem remarkably untroubled by what must have been a frightening experience," Eleanor observed, settling at her kitchen table where she could supervise meal preparation while maintaining conversation with her guests. "Children are often more resilient than adults give them credit for," James replied, accepting the coffee that Eleanor had prepared and settling into the kind of comfortable family interaction that suggested he had experience with multi-generational households. "They tend to focus on the adventure aspects of challenging situations rather than dwelling on the potential dangers that adults worry about." Eleanor began preparing lunch with the efficiency that Victoria remembered from childhood, but she was also conducting what amounted to a gentle interrogation of James. Where had he grown up? How long had he been practicing medicine in the mountains? What had motivated him to combine traditional knowledge with modern medical training? Did he have a family of his own? Victoria listened to James answer these questions with the same patient thoroughness he had demonstrated throughout their crisis, providing information that was comprehensive without being overly personal. She learned that he had never married, that his medical practice served a region covering over 200 square miles, and that he maintained his grandmother's cabin partly as an emergency shelter and partly as a connection to family traditions that he valued. But Victoria also noticed that Eleanor was evaluating James with the systematic attention that her mother brought to assessing anyone who might become important in her family's life. Eleanor was clearly impressed by his competence and character, but Victoria could see that her mother was also considering possibilities that extended beyond gratitude for rescue services. "Victoria," Eleanor said, turning from her meal preparation to address her daughter directly, "I hope you realize that Dr. Crowfeather's willingness to help your family extended well beyond standard rescue protocols. Spending the night to ensure your safety, providing shelter and meals, and escorting you here this morning represent the kind of personal commitment that deserves more than simple thanks." Victoria felt herself blushing as she recognized the direction her mother's comments were taking. Eleanor had always been direct about her opinions regarding Victoria's social life, and she had been particularly vocal about her belief that raising 4 children alone was both unnecessary and potentially detrimental to everyone involved. "Mom," Victoria said, with the warning tone that daughters use to discourage mothers from pursuing embarrassing topics in front of guests. "I'm simply observing," Eleanor replied, with the innocent expression that Victoria knew preceded her mother's most pointed social commentary, that some people are naturally suited for family life, regardless of whether they've had previous experience with it. James appeared to be suppressing a smile as he observed this family dynamic, but he had the wisdom to remain neutral during what was clearly a long-standing discussion between mother and daughter. Victoria appreciated his discretion, while simultaneously feeling mortified by her mother's transparent attempt at matchmaking. The lunch Eleanor prepared was spectacular, featuring ingredients that she had obviously been saving for special occasions, and prepared with the kind of attention to detail that transformed simple mountain cooking into something approaching gourmet cuisine. James contributed stories about his grandmother's cooking techniques, creating a conversation that bridged traditional and contemporary approaches to food preparation. But Victoria found herself thinking less about the meal and more about the way James interacted with her family, his easy rapport with the children, his respectful engagement with Eleanor's questions, and his apparent comfort with the kind of multi-generational gathering that had become increasingly rare in Victoria's urban social circle. She also found herself reconsidering assumptions she had been making about her life in Denver, her career, priorities, and her determination to prove that single parenthood required complete self-sufficiency. The previous day had demonstrated that community support wasn't a sign of weakness, but a practical necessity for navigating challenges that exceeded individual resources. As the afternoon progressed and James prepared for his return journey, Victoria realized that their adventure had changed more than just her understanding of mountain weather and emergency preparedness. It had also changed her perspective on what kinds of help she was willing to accept and what kinds of relationships she was prepared to consider for herself and her children. 3 weeks after the storm, Victoria stood in her Denver kitchen preparing breakfast for 4 children who had transformed their rescue adventure into the central mythology of their young lives. Emma had drawn 17 different pictures of Dr. James's truck for her preschool show-and-tell presentations. Ethan had convinced his teacher that he was now an expert on mountain survival techniques. Olivia insisted on wearing her winter coat indoors because it made her feel ready for adventures. Noah had developed an elaborate bedtime ritual that involved checking weather reports and ensuring that emergency supplies were properly distributed throughout their house. The children's adaptation to their experience had been remarkably positive, but Victoria found herself struggling with changes that were less visible and more complex. The confidence she had spent 8 months building around her ability to manage single parenthood independently had been fundamentally altered by 12 hours during which someone else had taken responsibility for her family's welfare and proven more competent at ensuring their survival than she had been. This wasn't necessarily a negative realization, but it was forcing Victoria to reconsider assumptions about strength, independence, and the kinds of help that were appropriate to accept. She had returned to her job at the marketing firm, where she worked as a project coordinator, but found herself distracted by thoughts about mountain communities, traditional knowledge, and the way James had moved between modern professional competence and ancestral wisdom with such natural ease. The phone rang while Victoria was packing lunches that had become increasingly elaborate since their adventure, as if proper nutrition could somehow protect against future emergencies. She expected the call to be routine, school scheduling, work coordination, or one of the dozens of administrative details that structured her daily existence. Instead, she heard James's voice and felt her pulse accelerate in ways that surprised her with their intensity. "Mrs. Chen, I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time," James said with the formal politeness that had characterized most of their interactions, though Victoria thought she detected something less professional in his tone. "Not at all," Victoria replied, realizing that she had been hoping for exactly this kind of contact, while simultaneously telling herself that expecting further communication would be unreasonable. "How are you? How are things in the mountains?" James explained that he was calling with updates about several practical matters related to their rescue. Victoria's minivan had been recovered from Forest Service Road 294 and transported to a garage in Bailey, where preliminary assessment suggested that damage was minimal and repairs would be straightforward. Insurance paperwork had been processed efficiently, and the vehicle should be ready for pickup within the next few days, but James was also calling with information that was more personally significant. The emergency shelter network that operated throughout the Colorado mountains was planning a winter preparedness workshop for families who lived in or regularly traveled through mountain regions. The workshop would cover topics ranging from vehicle winterization to emergency communication protocols, and James thought Victoria might be interested in participating. "It's partly about practical skills," James explained, "but it's also about connecting people who share common concerns about mountain safety. Your experience during the storm was unusual in its severity, but the underlying challenges you faced are ones that many families encounter during winter travel." Victoria found herself saying yes before she had fully considered the implications of spending a weekend in the mountains, learning survival skills from people who included James among their instructors. The workshop was scheduled for the first weekend in December, would be held at a conference center near Breckenridge, and would include both adult education sessions and activities designed for children. After ending the call, Victoria realized that she had committed herself and her family to something that represented a significant departure from their normal weekend routine. But she also realized that the prospect of returning to the mountains, learning from people who understood the environment that had nearly overwhelmed her family, felt more like an opportunity than an obligation. Eleanor called that evening with news that was both expected and transformative. Victoria's mother had been thinking about their Thanksgiving week conversation, particularly James's comments about mountain communities and the ways they supported families facing various challenges. "I've made a decision that I want to discuss with you," Eleanor said, with the tone that Victoria recognized as preceding announcements that would reshape family circumstances. "I'm planning to expand my cabin so that it can accommodate your family for extended visits, and I'm hoping you'll consider spending summers here starting next year." Eleanor explained that she had been researching educational options for the Quadruplets and had discovered that the local school district offered programs that emphasized outdoor education, environmental science, and the kind of hands-on learning that mountain communities had developed to prepare children for life in challenging environments. The children would benefit from clean air, outdoor activities, and the kind of community involvement that small towns provide, Eleanor continued. "But more importantly, you would benefit from having family support that doesn't require you to manage every challenge independently." Victoria listened to her mother's proposal with the mixture of relief and resistance that characterized her response to most offers of help. The practical advantages were obvious: reduced living expenses, built-in childcare, educational opportunities that Denver couldn't provide, and the kind of multi-generational family structure that could provide stability for children who had already experienced significant loss. But accepting Eleanor's offer would also require acknowledging that her determination to prove her competence as a single parent had been based partly on pride rather than on what was actually best for her family. "I need some time to think about this," Victoria said, though she was already calculating logistics and considering possibilities that she hadn't allowed herself to contemplate previously. The December workshop exceeded Victoria's expectations in ways that suggested her perspective on mountain living had been limited by inexperience rather than by accurate assessment. The families who participated represented a diverse cross-section of people who had chosen mountain life for reasons ranging from career opportunities to lifestyle preferences to simple love of alpine environments. Victoria learned practical skills that would have prevented or mitigated many of the challenges her family had encountered during the storm. Proper vehicle winterization, emergency communication equipment, route planning that accounted for weather variability, and survival techniques that could sustain families through extended emergencies. But she also learned about community networks. that provided support ranging from childcare cooperatives to professional mentoring, to the kind of informal assistance that made mountain living sustainable for families with various resource limitations. James served as one of the workshop instructors, teaching sessions that combined medical emergency response with traditional survival knowledge. Victoria watched him work with other families and realized that his competence during their rescue had been representative of expertise that he applied regularly to help people navigate mountain challenges successfully. She also realized that her attraction to James was based on more than gratitude for rescue services. His combination of professional achievement and commitment to community service, his comfort with both modern technology and traditional knowledge, and his natural ease with children and multi-generational family dynamics represented qualities that she found increasingly appealing as she reconsidered what kinds of relationships might be possible for her future. During a break between workshop sessions, James approached Victoria with the kind of careful formality that suggested he had been planning the conversation. "Mrs. Chen, I was wondering if you and your family might be interested in visiting my grandmother's cabin again," James said, his professional composure not quite concealing what Victoria thought might be personal nervousness. "The property is beautiful during winter, and I think your children would enjoy some of the activities that are possible when snow conditions are more stable." Victoria felt herself smiling with genuine warmth as she recognized that James was asking for something that went beyond professional courtesy or community service. "I think we would enjoy that very much, Dr. Crowfeather, and I think it's time you started calling me Victoria." The visit to James's cabin took place 2 weeks later and included Eleanor as well as the Quadruplets. What Victoria had expected to be a day trip extended into a weekend that felt like a natural continuation of relationships that had begun during their emergency but were developing into something more substantial and intentional. Eleanor and James discovered mutual interests in traditional crafts, local history, and approaches to education that emphasized practical skills alongside academic achievement. The Quadruplets explored winter activities that ranged from snowshoeing to wildlife tracking to learning basic outdoor cooking techniques using James's grandmother's equipment. But Victoria found herself most interested in conversations with James about the kinds of life choices that balanced professional achievement with community involvement, career advancement with family priorities, and personal independence with the acceptance of support from people who cared about her welfare. By February, Victoria had made decisions that would have seemed impossible during the previous autumn. She had negotiated with her employer to work remotely 4 days per week, allowing her to spend extended periods at Eleanor's cabin while maintaining career continuity. She had enrolled the Quadruplets in the local mountain school district for the following academic year, after visiting classrooms and meeting teachers who demonstrated the kind of individualized attention that urban schools couldn't provide. Most significantly, she'd begun a relationship with James that was developing with the careful intentionality that both of them brought to important decisions. Their courtship progressed through mountain activities that included the children and Eleanor, professional collaboration on community health initiatives, and conversations that explored compatibility regarding everything from parenting philosophy to career goals to approaches to balancing individual achievement with family responsibilities. By the time spring arrived and snow began melting from the high peaks, Victoria had moved her family permanently to Eleanor's expanded cabin. The transition had been easier than she had anticipated, partly because the Quadruplets adapted to mountain life with the enthusiasm they brought to most new experiences, but mostly because the support system that surrounded them made challenges manageable rather than overwhelming. Victoria's marketing skills proved valuable for mountain businesses that needed professional assistance with digital communications and customer outreach. Eleanor's experience as an educator provided resources for homeschooling activities that supplemented the children's formal education. James's medical expertise and community connections offered both professional opportunities and personal relationships that enriched their family's integration into mountain society. On a clear morning in late May, exactly 6 months after the storm that had brought them together, Victoria stood on Eleanor's deck watching her children play in the field behind the cabin, while James and her mother worked together in the garden that was beginning to show signs of the growing season ahead. The scene was peaceful in ways that contrasted dramatically with the chaos and fear that had characterized their first mountain experience, but Victoria realized that both experiences had been necessary for bringing her family to this point. The storm had demonstrated that individual strength had limitations, but it had also revealed that accepting help from competent, caring people could lead to outcomes that exceeded what any single person could achieve independently. Emma approached from the field, carrying wildflowers that she had been collecting for a bouquet intended for the kitchen table. "Mommy," she said with the serious expression that preceded her most important announcements, "I think we should live here forever." Victoria looked at her daughter, then at the mountains that surrounded their new home, and at the people who had become central to their family's happiness and security. "I think you might be right, sweetheart," she replied, understanding that some storms brought destruction, but others brought exactly the changes that were needed most. 2 years after the storm that changed everything, Victoria Chen Crow Feather stood at the altar of a small mountain chapel surrounded by aspen trees that had turned brilliant gold in the October light. The wedding was intimate by design. Eleanor, the Quadruplets, and 20 members of the tight-knit mountain community that had become their extended family. James wore his grandfather's ceremonial vest alongside his modern suit, honoring both traditions that had shaped his life. Victoria's dress was simple but elegant, chosen for beauty that would photograph well against the dramatic backdrop of snow-capped peaks visible through the chapel's windows. Emma, now 6 years old, and the self-appointed family spokesperson, had insisted on giving a speech during the ceremony. Standing on a wooden box that brought her to microphone height, she addressed the small gathering with the confidence that mountain living had nurtured in all 4 children. "Mommy and Dr. James got married because they love each other," Emma announced with the directness that characterized her approach to important topics. "But also because families work better when grown-ups help each other with hard things. We learned that during our adventure in the snow." The other children nodded solemnly from their positions as wedding party members. Ethan had taken his role as ring bearer with unprecedented seriousness, practicing his walk down the aisle for weeks. Olivia had selected flowers for her basket with the artistic eye that her mountain education was encouraging. Noah, the most reserved of the Quadruplets, had surprised everyone by volunteering to sing a song that James's grandmother had taught him during their many visits to the family cabin. Victoria felt tears gathering as she listened to her children speak about family, love, and the lessons they had learned from watching adults navigate challenges through cooperation rather than isolation. The Quadruplets had grown into confident, capable mountain kids who could identify animal tracks, predict weather changes, and solve problems with the resourcefulness that challenging environments taught naturally. But they had also retained the emotional intelligence and academic curiosity that Victoria's careful parenting had always encouraged. Their new school emphasized both outdoor education and traditional subjects, creating a balanced curriculum that prepared children for whatever paths their futures might require. Eleanor sat in the front row with the expression of profound satisfaction that grandmothers wore when family plans exceeded their most optimistic expectations. She had not only gained a son-in-law whose character and competence met her exacting standards, but had also seen her daughter discover happiness that went beyond simple contentment to encompass genuine excitement about future possibilities. The wedding reception took place at Eleanor's expanded cabin, which had grown over 2 years to accommodate the complex dynamics of a multi-generational household that included frequent guests from both the mountain community and Victoria's former life in Denver. The property now featured a main house, guest quarters, and workshop spaces that supported various family activities and Eleanor's growing involvement in local crafts traditions. James's medical practice had evolved to include Victoria's marketing expertise, allowing him to expand his services through telemedicine programs that connected mountain residents with specialized care available in urban medical centers. Victoria had discovered that her project coordination skills transferred perfectly to managing community health initiatives, grant applications, and the kind of multi-agency cooperation that rural healthcare required. The combination of their professional skills had created opportunities neither could have achieved independently, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that successful partnerships could multiply individual capabilities rather than simply dividing responsibilities. During the reception, Dr. Margaret Hernandez approached Victoria with congratulations that carried professional as well as personal significance. Margaret served as director of the Regional Medical Consortium that coordinated healthcare services across Colorado's mountain counties, and she had been following the innovative programs that James and Victoria had developed together. We've been discussing the possibility of expanding your telemedicine model to other mountain communities, Margaret said, her tone suggesting that casual conversation was leading toward formal opportunity. The State Health Department is interested in funding pilot programs that combine traditional medical services with community outreach and family education. Victoria felt the familiar excitement that accompanied recognition that her work was making meaningful differences in people's lives, but she also felt something new, confidence that she could pursue professional advancement without sacrificing family stability or community connections that had become central to her happiness. "I'd be very interested in learning more," Victoria replied, "but any expansion would need to maintain the community focus that makes our current programs effective. We're not just providing medical services, we're helping families develop the knowledge and relationships they need to thrive in mountain environments." The conversation continued through the evening, touching on possibilities that could significantly expand the impact of work that had begun as a natural collaboration between a mountain doctor and a relocated marketing professional. Victoria realized that she was considering career opportunities that were more ambitious than anything she had imagined during her years in corporate Denver, but which seemed achievable because they built on community relationships and family stability, rather than requiring sacrifice of either. As the reception wound down and guests began the careful process of navigating mountain roads in darkness, Victoria found herself on Eleanor's deck with James, watching their children play night games with flashlights under supervision of relatives who had accepted responsibility for bedtime management. 2 years ago, I thought my life was essentially decided," Victoria said, leaning against the deck railing while considering how dramatically circumstances could change when people were open to possibilities they hadn't previously considered. Widowed mother, corporate job, suburban routine, and the assumption that any major changes would probably represent loss rather than opportunity. James settled beside her with the comfortable ease that had characterized their relationship from its early stages. "My grandmother used to say that some people spent their whole lives waiting for permission to become who they were meant to be, while others recognized that permission came from being willing to accept help when it was offered." Victoria understood that James was referring to more than their personal relationship. The storm that had brought them together had also forced her to confront assumptions about independence, strength, and the kinds of support that were appropriate to accept from others. Learning to trust James's competence during their emergency had been the beginning of a process that eventually allowed her to trust his judgment about much more significant decisions. Their courtship had progressed through challenges that tested compatibility regarding everything from parenting philosophy to career priorities to approaches to balancing individual achievement with family responsibilities. Victoria had been determined not to repeat patterns from her marriage to Michael, where love had been assumed to be sufficient foundation for partnership without careful attention to practical compatibility. But James had approached their relationship with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to medical diagnosis, ensuring that emotional attraction was supported by shared values, complementary skills, and realistic assessment of what their combined future might include. The result was a partnership that felt both romantic and practical, combining genuine affection with the kind of mutual respect that could sustain a relationship through whatever challenges mountain life might present. Eleanor appeared on the deck, carrying hot chocolate that had become her signature contribution to family gatherings, along with news that the children had been successfully convinced to begin their bedtime routines, despite the excitement of staying up late for the wedding celebration. "I've been thinking about something that James mentioned during his speech," Eleanor said, settling into a deck chair that provided optimal views of both the conversation and the children's activities. "He talked about families being created through choice as well as circumstance, and I realized that's exactly what's happened with all of us." Eleanor explained that she had been considering how their family structure had evolved from traditional nuclear arrangements into something more complex but also more resilient. Victoria's children had gained not just a stepfather, but also an extended network of relationships that included James's medical colleagues, mountain community members, and the kind of multi-generational support that could provide stability through various future challenges. "But I've also gained a son whose character and competence exceed what I dared hope for when I was worrying about Victoria managing single parenthood," Eleanor continued. "And you've both gained professional opportunities that neither could have achieved independently." Victoria realized that her mother was describing outcomes that extended beyond individual happiness to encompass the kind of community integration that created mutual benefit for everyone involved. Their family's successful adaptation to mountain life had strengthened community resources, while community support had enabled their family to thrive in ways that isolated nuclear arrangements couldn't have sustained. 6 months later, Victoria stood in a conference room in Denver, addressing state health officials, university researchers, and healthcare administrators about expansion of the mountain telemedicine program that she and James had developed. The presentation represented professional achievement that exceeded anything she had accomplished during her corporate career, but it was achievement that built on community relationships rather than requiring sacrifice of family priorities. The program had grown to serve 12 mountain communities across 3 counties, connecting rural residents with specialized medical care while also providing education about emergency preparedness, preventive health practices, and the kind of self-reliance that mountain living required. Success was measured not just in improved health outcomes, but also in stronger community networks and family resilience that could handle various challenges more effectively. Victoria's role had evolved from marketing support for James's medical practice into program direction that combined healthcare administration with community development. She was completing graduate coursework in public health administration through online programs that allowed her to maintain her mountain residence while building credentials for increasingly responsible positions. But the work remained personally meaningful, because it addressed challenges that she had experienced directly and continued to encounter as a mountain resident. Every family that benefited from improved emergency preparedness protocols was a family that might avoid the kind of crisis that had nearly overwhelmed her own children during that November storm. James had been elected to the county health board, a position that utilized his medical expertise while also drawing on the community relationships that made him effective at building consensus around difficult policy decisions. Their combined influence was creating changes that would benefit mountain families for generations, but they were changes that emerged from local knowledge rather than external mandates. As Victoria concluded her presentation and fielded questions from officials, who were clearly impressed by both the program's outcomes and its potential for broader application, she realized that professional success felt different when it was connected to community benefit and family stability. The storm that had brought them together had taught her that individual strength had limitations, but building on that lesson had revealed that collaborative strength could achieve outcomes that exceeded what any single person could accomplish independently. That evening, Victoria returned to the mountain cabin, where Emma was helping Eleanor prepare dinner, while the other children completed homework assignments that included both traditional academic subjects and practical skills that mountain living required. James was reviewing medical charts in his home office, available for emergency calls, but also present for family conversations about daily events and future plans. The scene was peaceful in ways that had become routine rather than remarkable, but Victoria understood that ordinary happiness was actually extraordinary achievement for families that had survived significant loss and successfully rebuilt around new possibilities. 10 years later, Victoria Chen Crow Feather would serve as director of Colorado's Rural Health Initiative, overseeing programs that served mountain communities throughout the western United States. James would complete specialized training in wilderness medicine and establish the region's first comprehensive mountain rescue medical program. Eleanor would publish a book about multi-generational mountain living that became essential reading for families considering rural relocation. But those achievements were still in the future, as Victoria sat on her deck that October evening, watching her children play in the field behind their cabin, while the man she had married worked quietly in the next room, and her mother planned activities that would keep 3 generations busy and engaged through another mountain winter. The storm that had changed everything was now just family history, retold during gatherings when children needed reminding that adults sometimes required help and that accepting assistance from competent, caring people could lead to outcomes better than what anyone could achieve alone. 2 years after the storm that changed everything, Victoria Chen Crow Feather stood at the altar of a small mountain chapel surrounded by aspen trees that had turned brilliant gold in the October light. The wedding was intimate by design. Eleanor, the Quadruplets, and 20 members of the tight-knit mountain community that had become their extended family. James wore his grandfather's ceremonial vest alongside his modern suit, honoring both traditions that had shaped his life. Victoria's dress was simple but elegant, chosen for beauty that would photograph well against the dramatic backdrop of snow-capped peaks visible through the chapel's windows. Emma, now 6 years old, and the self-appointed family spokesperson, had insisted on giving a speech during the ceremony. Standing on a wooden box that brought her to microphone height, she addressed the small gathering with the confidence that mountain living had nurtured in all 4 children. Mommy and Dr. James got married because they love each other, Emma announced with the directness that characterized her approach to important topics, but also because families work better when grown-ups help each other with hard things, We learned that during our adventure in the snow. The other children nodded solemnly from their positions as wedding party members. Ethan had taken his role as ring-bearer with unprecedented seriousness, practicing his walk down the aisle for weeks. Olivia had selected flowers for her basket with the artistic eye that her mountain education was encouraging. Noah, the most reserved of the quadruplets, had surprised everyone by volunteering to sing a song that James's grandmother had taught him during their many visits to the family cabin. Victoria felt tears gathering as she listened to her children speak about family, love, and the lessons they had learned from watching adults navigate challenges through cooperation rather than isolation. The quadruplets had grown into confident, capable mountain kids who could identify animal tracks, predict weather changes, and solve problems with the resourcefulness that challenging environments taught naturally. But they had also retained the emotional intelligence and academic curiosity that Victoria's careful parenting had always encouraged. Their new school emphasized both outdoor education and traditional subjects, creating a balanced curriculum that prepared children for whatever paths their futures might require. Eleanor sat in the front row with the expression of profound satisfaction that grandmothers wore when family plans exceeded their most optimistic expectations. She had not only gained a son-in-law whose character and competence met her exacting standards, but had also seen her daughter discover happiness that went beyond simple contentment to encompass genuine excitement about future possibilities. The wedding reception took place at Eleanor's expanded cabin, which had grown over 2 years to accommodate the complex dynamics of a multi-generational household that included frequent guests from both the mountain community and Victoria's former life in Denver. The property now featured a main house, guest quarters, and workshop spaces that supported various family activities and Eleanor's growing involvement in local crafts traditions. James's medical practice had evolved to include Victoria's marketing expertise, allowing him to expand his services through telemedicine programs that connected mountain residents with specialized care available in urban medical centers. Victoria had discovered that her project coordination skills transferred perfectly to managing community health initiatives, grant applications, and the kind of multi-agency cooperation that rural healthcare required. The combination of their professional skills had created opportunities neither could have achieved independently, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that successful partnerships could multiply individual capabilities rather than simply dividing responsibilities. During the reception, Dr. Margaret Hernandez approached Victoria with congratulations that carried professional as well as personal significance. Margaret served as director of the Regional Medical Consortium that coordinated healthcare services across Colorado's mountain counties, and she'd been following the innovative programs that James and Victoria had developed together. "We've been discussing the possibility of expanding your telemedicine model to other mountain communities," Margaret said, her tone suggesting that casual conversation was leading toward formal opportunity. "The State Health Department is interested in funding pilot programs that combine traditional medical services with community outreach and family education." Victoria felt the familiar excitement that accompanied recognition that her work was making meaningful differences in people's lives. But she also felt something new, confidence that she could pursue professional advancement without sacrificing family stability or community connections that had become central to her happiness. "I'd be very interested in learning more," Victoria replied, "but any expansion would need to maintain the community focus that makes our current programs effective. We're not just providing medical services, we're helping families develop the knowledge and relationships they need to thrive in mountain environments. The conversation continued through the evening, touching on possibilities that could significantly expand the impact of work that had begun as a natural collaboration between a mountain doctor and a relocated marketing professional. Victoria realized that she was considering career opportunities that were more ambitious than anything she had imagined during her years in corporate Denver, but which seemed achievable because they built on community relationships and family stability rather than requiring sacrifice of either. As the reception wound down and guests began the careful process of navigating mountain roads in darkness, Victoria found herself on Eleanor's deck with James, watching their children play night games with flashlights under supervision of relatives who had accepted responsibility for bedtime management. 2 years ago, I thought my life was essentially decided, Victoria said, leaning against the deck railing while considering how dramatically circumstances could change when people were open to possibilities they hadn't previously considered. Widowed mother, corporate job, suburban routine, and the assumption that any major changes would probably represent loss rather than opportunity. James settled beside her with the comfortable ease that had characterized their relationship from its early stages. My grandmother used to say that some people spent their whole lives waiting for permission to become who they were meant to be, while others recognized that permission came from being willing to accept help when it was offered. Victoria understood that James was referring to more than their personal relationship. The storm that had brought them together had also forced her to confront assumptions about independence, strength, and the kinds of support that were appropriate to accept from others. Learning to trust James's competence during their emergency had been the beginning of a process that eventually allowed her to trust his judgment about much more significant decisions. Their courtship had progressed through challenges that tested compatibility regarding everything from parenting philosophy to career priorities, to approaches to balancing individual achievement with family responsibilities. Victoria had been determined not to repeat patterns from her marriage to Michael, where love had been assumed to be sufficient foundation for partnership without careful attention to practical compatibility. But James had approached their relationship with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to medical diagnosis, ensuring that emotional attraction was supported by shared values, complementary skills, and realistic assessment of what their combined future might include. The result was partnership that felt both romantic and practical, combining genuine affection with the kind of mutual respect that could sustain a relationship through whatever challenges mountain life might present. Eleanor appeared on the deck carrying hot chocolate that had become her signature contribution to family gatherings, along with news that the children had been successfully convinced to begin their bedtime routines, despite the excitement of staying up late for the wedding celebration. "I've been thinking about something that James mentioned during his speech," Eleanor said, settling into a deck chair that provided optimal views of both the conversation and the children's activities. He talked about families being created through choice as well as circumstance, and I realized that's exactly what's happened with all of us. Eleanor explained that she had been considering how their family structure had evolved from traditional nuclear arrangements into something more complex but also more resilient. Victoria's children had gained not just a stepfather, but also an extended network of relationships that included James's medical colleagues, mountain community members, and the kind of multi-generational support that could provide stability through various future challenges. But I've also gained a son whose character and competence exceed what I dared hope for when I was worrying about Victoria managing single parenthood," Eleanor continued, "and you've both gained professional opportunities that neither could have achieved independently. Victoria realized that her mother was describing outcomes that extended beyond individual happiness to encompass the kind of community integration that created mutual benefit for everyone involved. Their family's successful adaptation to mountain life had strengthened community resources, while community support had enabled their family to thrive in ways that isolated nuclear arrangements couldn't have sustained. 6 months later, Victoria stood in a conference room in Denver, addressing state health officials, university researchers, and healthcare administrators about expansion of the mountain telemedicine program that she and James had developed. The presentation represented professional achievement that exceeded anything she had accomplished during her corporate career. But it was achievement that built on community relationships rather than requiring sacrifice of family priorities. The program had grown to serve 12 mountain communities across 3 counties, connecting rural residents with specialized medical care, while also providing education about emergency preparedness, preventive health practices, and the kind of self-reliance that mountain living required. Success was measured not just in improved health outcomes, but also in stronger community networks and family resilience that could handle various challenges more effectively. Victoria's role had evolved from marketing support for James's medical practice into program direction that combined healthcare administration with community development. She was completing graduate coursework in public health administration through online programs that allowed her to maintain her mountain residence while building credentials for increasingly responsible positions. But the work remained personally meaningful because it addressed challenges that she had experienced directly and continued to encounter as a mountain resident. Every family that benefited from improved emergency preparedness protocols was a family that might avoid the kind of crisis that had nearly overwhelmed her own children during that November storm. James had been elected to the County Health Board, a position that utilized his medical expertise while also drawing on the community relationships that made him effective at building consensus around difficult policy decisions. Their combined influence was creating changes that would benefit mountain families for generations, but they were changes that emerged from local knowledge rather than external mandates. As Victoria concluded her presentation and fielded questions from officials who were clearly impressed by both the program's outcomes and its potential for broader application, she realized that professional success felt different when it was connected to community benefit and family stability. The storm that had brought them together had taught her that individual strength had limitations, but building on that lesson had revealed that collaborative strength could achieve outcomes that exceeded what any single person could accomplish independently. That evening, Victoria returned to the mountain cabin where Emma was helping Eleanor prepare dinner, while the other children completed homework assignments that included both traditional academic subjects and practical skills that mountain living required. James was reviewing medical charts in his home office, available for emergency calls, but also present for family conversations about daily events and future plans. The scene was peaceful in ways that had become routine rather than remarkable, but Victoria understood that ordinary happiness was actually extraordinary achievement for families that had survived significant loss and successfully rebuilt around new possibilities. 10 years later, Victoria Chen Crow Feather would serve as director of Colorado's Rural Health Initiative, overseeing programs that served mountain communities throughout the western United States. James would complete specialized training in wilderness medicine and establish the region's first comprehensive mountain rescue medical program. Eleanor would publish a book about multi-generational mountain living that became essential reading for families considering rural relocation. But those achievements were still in the future as Victoria sat on her deck that October evening, watching Her children play in the field behind their cabin, while the man she had married worked quietly in the next room, and her mother planned activities that would keep 3 generations busy and engaged through another mountain winter. The storm that had changed everything was now just family history, retold during gatherings when children needed reminding that adults sometimes required help and that accepting assistance from competent, caring people could lead to outcomes better than what anyone could achieve alone. 15 years had passed since that November storm changed everything. Victoria stood at the podium of the National Rural Health Conference in Denver, looking out at an audience of healthcare professionals, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country. Her presentation on integrated mountain healthcare systems had drawn the largest attendance of the 3-day conference, but she found herself thinking less about professional recognition and more about the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. Effective rural healthcare isn't just about medical services, Victoria said, clicking to a slide that showed children learning wilderness first aid alongside traditional academic subjects. It's about building community resilience that enables families to thrive in challenging environments while maintaining access to resources they need for long-term success. In the audience, James sat with the quiet pride that had characterized his support throughout her career advancement. Now director of the Colorado Mountain Medical Consortium, he had spent the morning in policy meetings that would shape rural healthcare funding for the next decade. Their professional partnership had evolved into influence that extended far beyond their original mountain community, but it remained grounded in relationships and local knowledge that kept their work personally meaningful. Eleanor, now 87, and still formidably sharp, had chosen to attend the conference despite her usual preference for avoiding large gatherings. She sat in the front row with a tablet, taking notes on her daughter's presentation with the systematic attention to detail that had made her an exceptional teacher. Eleanor's book on multi-generational mountain living had become required reading in graduate programs, studying rural community development, but she insisted that her greatest achievement was raising a daughter who had learned to balance professional ambition with family commitment. The Quadruplets, now 19 years old and college sophomores, had returned from their respective universities to support their mother's keynote presentation. Emma was studying environmental science at Colorado State University, combining her childhood love of mountain ecology with the analytical skills that Victoria's careful nurturing had developed. Ethan was pursuing emergency medical training at the University of Colorado, following a path that honored both James's influence and his own natural aptitude for crisis management. Olivia had surprised everyone by choosing art therapy as her major, recognizing that her sensitivity to emotional undercurrents could be developed into professional skills that served communities dealing with trauma and transition. Noah, the quietest of the 4, was studying engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure for rural communities, applying the problem-solving abilities that mountain living had encouraged. All 4 had grown into young adults who combined academic achievement with practical competence, emotional intelligence with professional ambition, and deep appreciation for family relationships with confidence about their individual futures. Victoria realized that their early experience with genuine crisis had taught them lessons about resilience and cooperation that most people learned much later in life, if at all. After the presentation, Victoria was surrounded by colleagues and administrators who wanted to discuss funding opportunities, research partnerships, and program expansion possibilities. The attention was gratifying, but she found herself looking forward to the quiet evening planned with her family at Eleanor's cabin, where they would celebrate another milestone in lives that had exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. Dr. Margaret Hernandez, now serving as Deputy Director of the Federal Office of Rural Health, approached Victoria with the kind of smile that preceded significant announcements. The Department of Health and Human Services wants to offer you the position of National Director for Rural Healthcare Innovation, Margaret said quietly, ensuring that their conversation remained private despite the crowded reception area. It would mean relocating to Washington for at least 3 years, but it would also mean implementing programs like yours on a scale that could transform rural healthcare throughout the United States. Victoria felt the familiar mixture of excitement and careful consideration that accompanied major professional opportunities. The position represented career advancement beyond anything she had imagined possible 15 years earlier, when she was struggling to manage single parenthood while maintaining basic financial stability. But she also knew that accepting would require family decisions that couldn't be made unilaterally. James's work in Colorado was reaching critical stages that would benefit from his continued direct involvement. Eleanor's age and health made relocation increasingly difficult. The Quadruplets were established in universities and summer jobs that connected them to the mountain community that had shaped their development. "I'm deeply honored by the offer," Victoria replied. "But I'll need time to discuss this with my family before I can give you a definitive answer." Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had navigated similar decisions throughout her own career. "Of course, take whatever time you need, but I hope you'll seriously consider it. The work you've done in Colorado proves that rural healthcare can be both innovative and sustainable when it's built on community relationships rather than imposed from outside." That evening, the family gathered around Eleanor's dining table for the kind of extended conversation that important decisions required. Victoria presented the opportunity honestly, explaining both the professional significance and the personal disruptions that accepting would entail. James was the first to respond, with the supportive pragmatism that had characterized his approach to their partnership from its beginning. "This is the kind of opportunity that comes once in a career," he said, reaching across the table to take Victoria's hand. "If you turn it down, you'll always wonder what might have been accomplished. If you accept it, we'll figure out how to make the logistics work." Eleanor's response was more complex, reflecting her understanding of family dynamics that extended beyond immediate practical considerations. "I'm proud that my daughter has achieved recognition for work that makes genuine differences in people's lives," Eleanor said slowly. "But I'm also aware that I'm 87 years old, and the time I have left with all of you is more precious than professional achievements, no matter how significant." The conversation continued for hours, touching on possibilities that ranged from family relocation to long-distance coordination, to creative arrangements that might allow Victoria to accept the position while maintaining connections to Colorado. Emma suggested that the experience of living in Washington could provide educational opportunities that small-town Colorado couldn't offer. Ethan pointed out that emergency medical training might benefit from exposure to urban healthcare systems. Olivia wondered whether art therapy programs in Washington might provide internship opportunities that could enhance her education. Noah, characteristically, asked the practical questions that others had been avoiding. "What happens to Grandma? Eleanor, if we all move to Washington? What happens to Dad's work if he leaves Colorado? What happens to our family if we're separated by distance and different schedules?" Victoria realized that her youngest son had identified the core challenge that professional success often presented to people who had built their lives around family relationships and community connections. Individual achievement could sometimes require sacrifices that affected everyone in interconnected ways. The decision, when it came, reflected the collaborative approach to problem-solving that the family had developed over 15 years of navigating challenges together. Victoria would accept the position for a 3-year term, but the family would maintain their Colorado residence with James, continuing his work there. Victoria would spend weekdays in Washington and return to Colorado for extended weekends, holidays, and summer periods. Eleanor would remain in her cabin with support from local community networks that had become extended family over the years. The arrangement would be challenging, but it would allow Victoria to contribute to national policy while maintaining the family relationships and community connections that had made her professional success personally meaningful. 3 years later, Victoria returned to Colorado with achievements that included the establishment of rural healthcare innovation centers in 12 states, federal funding for community-based health education programs, and policy changes that recognize the importance of local knowledge in designing effective rural services. But her greatest satisfaction came from returning to the mountain cabin, where Eleanor was teaching the next generation of neighborhood children about traditional crafts, where James had expanded his medical practice to include international wilderness medicine training, and where the Quadruplets brought their own children to experience the mountain summers that had shaped their development. The storm that had changed everything was now family legend, retold during gatherings when new generations needed reminding that strength came not from individual capability, but from the willingness to accept help and build relationships that could weather any challenge. Victoria Chen Crow Feather had learned that some crises destroyed what people thought they needed, but others revealed what they actually required for happiness that could last a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.